Hello, it's nice to see you all. I hope you had a good weekend. Good. So we're starting with a few TED Talks today. Who would like to go first? Bia?
Never mind.
Okay. Bia, then Brad, and then I didn't know who else had their hands up. Then Lucas. Okay. Terrific. Great. Let's see. Bia, are you presenting from your iPad again?
I'll try, but if not, would you still be able to share? Okay, I'll try.
Let me open the part I need to get that. Does it look like it might work?
Okay, let me see. No, it says only the host can share something in the meeting. So.
Yes. Thank you for that reminder. Okay. Okay, let's try it again.
Okay. No, it wouldn't let me.
It won't work. Okay, we'll do it from my screen.
Sure.
Bia, if you'll hand back the hosting function to me, please.
Yes, of course.
Okay. Great. Now, are you seeing, it should say TED Talk?
Yeah.
Chan Bowery? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Perfect. So today I'm going to be talking about Chan Bowery. You can change the slide.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So just some basic information on Chan Bowery. It is a square-shaped structure with 4 relatively high octagonal towers on each edge. And it is considered to be a stepwell because it displays a great amount of architectural cross steps leading to the bottom and a well at the center. I've never visited it because I've never been to the Middle East or Asia in any way, but India is definitely on my travel bucket list. You can change the slide. Okay, so Chan Bowery is situated in the village of Abaneri, which is near the city of Jaipur in the Indian state of Rajasthan. And it is located 95 kilometers, which is about 2 hours car drive from the city of Jaipur. You can change the slide. Chan Bowery is said to be named after a local ruler called Raja Chanda, and it is dated to the 8th and 9th century. And it was likely constructed before the temple that is situated nearby the structure. As you can see from the picture, it is a stepwell. And at the time, stepwell was used as a water source because it provided water for washing, bathing, drinking, and for the irrigation of crops as well. It also served as cool sanctuary for caravans, pilgrims, and travelers. And it is a stunning example of Hindu and Islamic architecture. It incorporates flights of stairs leading down to the water, and it functioned at the time as a Hindu temple that featured column-supported shade pavilions and elaborate stone carvings. The construction involved the careful placement of a wide stone-lined sloping excavation that allowed for water access. And originally, the idea of having a stepwell first appeared in India in the 3rd century CE because it was born out of necessity because of the dry monsoonal climate zone. You can change the slide. So about the interior, it displays tabulated arches used by the Kawan rulers and cusped arches used by the Mughals. These two were big empires in India and Asia in general at the time. The upper stories with colonnade arcade around it were built by the Mughals, and they also added art galleries and a retaining wall around the well. As you can see, the interior architecture is just beautiful. From the beauty and splendor of the columns and detailed arches to the very clever engineering and the practical use of the building. The columns and pointed arches resemble the Islamic style, as you can see from the left-hand picture, whereas on the right-hand picture, the long and open hallways with closed round arches resemble the Roman style. You can change the slide. The building is simpler on the outside. As you can see, the walls look strong and heavy, but definitely less detailed than the interior walls and the interior architectural structures. And as soon as I looked at the exterior from the picture, which is depicting the structure from above, it kind of reminded me of a technological constructing game that I used to play when I was younger, which is called Minecraft. I don't know if anyone knows about it, but it's just because it's very fine and highly geometrical excavation and construction of buildings. So it kind of reminded me of that. And I also found the same building in a Minecraft picture, so I thought it was funny, yeah. So about the plan, as you can see, the structure is a square with 4 octagonal towers on each edge. And as I look at both the plan and section, I noticed that the staircase leading down to the water really resembled the Nabatean cross-step style, which is from the 6th century BCE. And it also makes sense because the building is from the 8th or 9th century, so they probably have taken some inspiration from the Nabateal architectural style. The Harshat Mata temple, which is nearby to the main structure, was a pilgrimage site, and it formed a complex together with the well. Unfortunately, it was partially destroyed and damaged by Mahmud Ghazni, and many of its pillars, columns, and statues now lie scattered in the temple courtyard and in the corridors of the building. The temple was originally dedicated to Harshat Mata, which is the goddess of happiness and joy. And she spread her glow and brightness called Abba, which is the name that comes from the village, Abaneri. As you can see, the temple has an incredible level of detail, And from the right-hand picture and the lower right-hand picture, it displays detailed carvings on the columns, and the capitals really resemble the Corinthian style order. So I think the temple is probably one of my favorite parts of the entire complex, besides the well.
Great, fantastic. So when I originally came up with this section of the course, it was all about water. And the first time I saw these images of the step wells, I was just blown away because they are this chthonic structure, right? They are carved out of the earth. And the elaborate nature of these wells, I mean, they're designed, these are highly gendered spaces. It was the women's duty in this time period to gather the water. And so they were designed all around the idea of female bodies moving through space for water gathering. It's just, I love that you put that Minecraft image in there because it is just this wild, sort of out of this world thing that is not out of this world. There are numerous and built all across the Indian subcontinent. There's these beautiful, beautiful spaces all about the practice and the value of water to society. So well done.
Yeah, it's definitely a very different structure from everything that we have looked at so far. So I really like that, especially the idea of the stepwell going down. Yeah, it was really nice.
And you can imagine sort of the performative nature of this, as we've seen on some of the pyramids before, just watching those women, imagining those women moving down that elaborate staircase. It's very performative, whether that was performative for the gods that were honored in the carvings in the exterior temple that you showed, or whether it was just a beautification of a very essential practice. So yeah, nicely done. Any questions or comments about this? Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So next, who's going next? Brad's going next. I will, okay. You should be able to take over the screen.
All right. I still don't think I'm the host.
It's Shu.
Same. Yeah, you got it now.
Yep.
All right.
Let me send it back to you again.
Sweet.
Okay.
Is it working? Can you guys see it?
It's coming up? Yes.
Awesome. Alrighty. So this is Reni Ki Vav. It is located in the city of Patan. I'm gonna see if I can get rid of this actually. Located in Patan alongside the Saraswati River. It was built in the 11th century. Eventually that river flooded the stepwell and it became filled with silt and it was lost until 1940. They finished restoring it in 1980 and now it's open to the public. Also, it's called the Queen's Stepwell because that's what it translates to. And for the sake of pronunciation, I'm just gonna roll with that. Okay, so as B kind of said, stepwells were very common in the region at the time. At first they were, pretty much just kind of like holes in the ground, but as time went on, they became more elaborate and more decorative. This stepwell was built during like the peak era of stepwell building, and it has three major functions. The first was that it was originally built as a memorial for a king, but it turned out that it was more practical to be used as like a storage system or source of water, and also a temple that honors the sanctity of water. And honestly, you can kind of imagine yourself going down these stairs with all these giant walls and geometrical patterns, which I'll show later, but that would definitely be kind of like a sacred experience for somebody. Additionally, this stepwell is a little weird because it's 2D images don't really do it justice. I think that like the best way to experience it is definitely by going there. So I'm gonna show us this cool ground. This is it in like a 3D model.
Fantastic.
As we can see, I'm sorry, did you say something?
Just fantastic. That's great.
Okay. Awesome. But yeah, like B said, we can see, you know, like the Nabatean shapes on the stairs right here. It's very highly geometrical. You can even go down in the well here. I like doing this. You can see all the different levels, just how deep it is. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, very, very geometrical. And like, you can see how it would be hard to, you know, really, really get just from 2D images. Additionally, there would be statues all along the walls. Last time I tried to load them, it crashed my computer. So I'll show you them right here. This is an example of one that would have been there. It's the statue of Vishnu. And once again, we see, you know, just the extent of the geometry and the craftsmanship that went in here, especially these little guys that are kind of hanging out around them on the side. Really cool statue. And like I said, all of the walls would have been covered in these. I'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, so the Queen's Stepwell was designed to be an inverted temple. An inverted temple, you know, usually you think of temples being built above ground, with the most sacred thing being at the back or the top of it. However, this one, it's kind of not the case. It's built into the ground, and the most sacred thing is the water source at the very bottom and the back. That well that we've just looked at is 98 feet deep. There's 7 levels of stairs in the stepwell. Additionally, there are 212 of these pillars right here. And there are 400 of these little niches in the wall where these statues would be. As the top part was reconstructed, but we can see from the earlier ones that these were also very highly decorated with a lot of carvings on them. And there would have been a statue in every one of these frames almost. And we'll talk a little bit about the statues. I think this is really interesting. So there are 500 principal statues with over 1,000 minor ones. If you look at the pictures on the right, all of these would have been considered to be, you know, principal sculptures. There's quite a difference in the types of sculptures that they found there. If we look at the one on the bottom, this is a god from their religion, and if we look at the one on the top, it's not. It's actually just a scene from daily life, which is really interesting. We see the woman on the left right here is just putting lipstick on. And this woman right here is actually having her clothes ripped off by a monkey. So we can see that they're very different. And honestly, it makes sense that they have religious stuff there because it's a temple, obviously. But at the end of the day, this was also the water source for the entire community, meaning that, you know, you'd probably wake up and start your day by going here to pick up your water. So the Queen's Stepwell really served to be, you know, kind of a place for community, kind of a place for meeting people. And I'm sure like a lot of business and a lot of, you know, relationships were made at this site. And yeah, that's all I got, you guys. Thank you for listening.
Terrific, Brad. Thank you so much for that 3D exploration and the great images of the sculpture there. It's really fantastic.
Thank you.
Questions, comments? There is this fascinating mix of kind of sacred and profane sculptures on those walls, right? Almost.
Yeah, I was looking at them, and you can't put some of them are not school appropriate at all.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I was going to ask, because that does occur across many of these sites, and I am wondering, without putting you in an awkward spot, but there's something about the sexualization of the bodies in those images that you showed, and also, of course, the shape of the stepwell itself. There's a way that they are playing on that that female form in many different dimensions.
Yeah.
Do you find that to be the case in the images that you looked at as well?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. It definitely goes to what you were saying in B's presentation about like how they thought the whole water aspect of their religion and stuff was very feminine, and how the gods were also represented by females. So
yeah, fantastic, really great. Okay, let's see, Jack and who else was left to give a presentation? Lucas as well. Okay, Lucas, I think you were hoping to go first, so would you like to go next? Does that work for you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That works.
And Jack, does that work in terms of your work schedule? I know you're, okay, great. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So just a second. Okay, Lucas, you should be able to share your screen.
All right. Perfect. Can everybody see?
Yes. Yep.
Awesome. All right, so mine is on the Ziggurat. It's located in modern day Iraq in the Dhar province. I'm sorry if I butcher any of these. I'm really not the best with Arabic. This is actually kind of a unique site in terms of things that we've looked, because it really has not been looted at all. We are not looking at the original. It's been restored a couple of times, once to antiquity, once pretty recently, and we'll get to that later. But the reason it hasn't been looted is most of this was underground, excavated in the 1920s, and then since then it's been located right on the edge of an Iraqi air base. So it's pretty hard to get to, and if you're going to loot it, you're going to mess with the air. So no one really touches this. The air base also plays into it later. So this was originally built in about 100 BC by a king by the name Ur-Nammu, temple, or ziggurat at Ur, his naming. It was the finest. I'm sorry, my internet's on something a weird here. But here, this was a temple for a moon god called Nana. And it also served as a place where they would surplus food, water to store. It was just a kind of a central location for the city-state. It was excavated in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley, and he was helped by the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the British Museum in London. I have been, or if any of you have been there, awesome museums. And the first restoration occurred way back in antiquity, probably around the 6th century BC. It was repaired by somebody called King Odious. Found it in slightly shambles. It is created out of a mud brick, which does deteriorate with time. So he went in and he did some restorations of the terraces, which we'll get to. Second restoration in the 1980s by Saddam Hussein, which was kind of crazy to figure out. He repaired the 3 main staircases, which you can see United States image. And then he was responsible for the partial destruction of after he restored it, as a son and was going to park his big jets right next to it in hopes coalition troops wouldn't bomb his jets, the priceless artifact. Well, the US, what we did, unfortunately, is we bombed the outside of the jets and sent shrapnel into the building. So there's some bomb craters nearby. There are bullets in the structure, but it still stands, still okay for now. And then we'll get to some symbolism. So, as I said, a temple for a moon god called Nana. And the 4 sides, kind of like an Egyptian pyramid, they rise up to meet the gods. But different from an Egyptian pyramid, this isn't a smooth structure at all. There are several tiers, or they call them terraces. There's 3 of them. Each tier gets slightly more divine, the top tier having a temple to the moon god Nana. So this is oriented true north, which they found to be pretty crazy back in the time because they didn't know how they were able to get it north. And it was actually dead north. It was not magnetic north. It is true north on the globe. So they were really surprised to find that out. And it's about 200 to 150 feet. So it is a large structure. The height is just, they only found this when they were excavating it. So it's pretty uncertain how large it was, but just the lower portion alone, just the first terrace was 720,000 mud bricks. So this is an enormous structure. No one could even figure out.
Let's see, Lucas, I think we've lost your voice here.
Which is thick in the structure. And the outside mud bricks, they were more wide, and then they were covered in a natural tar called bitumen, which helped them with the weather. And for an elevation, as I said, they were guessing on the height, but the base, they kind of inferred that it was between 70 and 100 tall. And the 3 main staircases led up to that terrace. those were the 3 staircases repaired by Saddam Hussein. There is only a single staircase to the 2nd and 3rd terrace level. And that final terrace, there's the temple for the moon god Nana. And there is a priest's quarters for the moon god. And then also one maiden was chosen to live there, which was the god's companion in their time. And just overall, this is an amazing structure, a wonder of the ancient world. But it is also a lesson about like the value structure, especially in an area, is pretty hot tested. Even bombed the site. Into Mesopotamian structures. Yeah. You got
Great. So, Lucas, thank you for that. And it's such a nice companion with the stepwells because we have the inversion of the form in looking at the 2 side by side. Can you remind me the date for the construction of Ur?
2100 BC.
Right. Okay. It's one of the oldest structures that we have looked at, and it which does raise the question, as you pointed out, of preservation, of thinking about wartime action, things that we've thought about in military action one after another. World War II, this came to a peak when the U.S. Army finally hired a group of art historians to come in and advise them on which sites not to bomb. It's very problematic, being involved as that art history team, the importance of the work that they're doing, complications of being there, picking which sites can and can't be touched. But great work. Thank you, Lucas.
All right.
Okay.
I think I made you the host.
Okay, terrific. Yep, great. And then Jack, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome.
Okay.
Wait, hold on, I pressed the wrong thing. All right, so I'm gonna be doing my presentation on the Brooks. So I'm sure, especially like with moving in and out of Wake, people have been in cramped cars or kind of been in close quarters with one another at some time or another. And I'm sure a lot of you have been on boats before. So kind of combining those 2 aspects together, we're going to look at what it was like to cross the Atlantic on one of these slaver ships in the late 18th century. So we're going to move on to the history. The Brooks is a Liverpool trade ship. It was built in about around 1780s. Some say 1783 to 1784. It was named after the owner, who's James Brooks. During its time, it carried over 600 slaves from each trip from West Africa to the Caribbean. This path was called the Middle Passage. It's a large triangle that takes goods from Africa to, from Europe to Africa, and then takes slaves from Africa to the New World, the Americas, and then takes goods from the Americas back to Europe. And these conditions on these slave ships were far from ideal. They were very tight, very, very small. The name of the game was packing as many things as possible to try to get across that passage. And so going with that, you really had to pack in slaves as tight as you could. The average space allotment for a male individual was about a 6 feet long, kind of laying down wise. You had 6 feet in length, 16 inches wide. And you were about 2 feet below the floorboards that were above you. This varies for women and children because the women and children had about 5 feet of space. So you can imagine if you were a exceptionally tall woman or child, you'd have a rough time kind of fitting where they wanted you to go. This led to very bad conditions on these passage. The mortality rate for an average slave on these ships was about 13%. Many contracted dysentery, many have fevers, and there's also a high rate of suicide just from the terrible conditions that the boat had. Although it was very, very tight quarters, they weren't spending their entire days in these scenarios. They'd be let above deck to do chores and clean the ship and sometimes dance for the owners or the people that would be bringing them to and from Africa. And since there was such a high mortality rate and they wanted to save space or gain space, a lot of dead bodies were jettisoned off to the ocean during the passage. So we can't really know how many exactly died during these trips because many bodies were just unaccounted for. But all around, you could tell that it was just a terrible situation to be in, to find yourself in, and so bad that Parliament began to regulate the number of slaves that a ship could take, because it just got so terrible. And the Brooks could hold 454, which is still, that was regulated. It's still very, very tight. I mean, they would still overpack it. No matter what, you had a rough time being on those ships. So now moving on to the impact. So the Brooks was not unlike every other ship of its time. What makes it so significant is that there was a newsletter that was used by a Quaker named Thomas Clarkson, who printed it in a book called, I got to get this right, In the History of the Rise, Progress, and Accomplishment of the Abolition of the African Slave Trade by the British Parliament. And that was published in 1808. And so this image that you are seeing here was published, and it shows, you can see here all the different, how they're aligned. Some were head to head, lengthwise, some were side to side. There was mainly two decks they'd be dispersed between. One would be as packed as this one here, and then another one would be laying around the edge of it. And also, I forgot to mention in the last slide, it's hard to imagine on these pictures to see how cramped it was. So here's a picture of a demonstration of how tight these quarters would have been. And you can see, you're spending months at a time sleeping just like this and spending most of your day just like this. And it's really just dreadful conditions. So the Brooks was just known for getting people to know how these slave ships actually operated and how terrible this passage really was. So it was a big proponent in the late 18th century abolitionist movement. And it's just, I can't overstate how awful this would have been to be inside of. Many people died just in the positions that they were set in at the beginning of the trip. Now moving on to the architecture. There's multi-layered, as you can see, what was released was a multi-layered plan. Really the impact was just how closely people were put together. There was probably plenty more room where people could have been dispersed throughout the ship, but it was taken up by supplies as well as the living quarters for the actual crew. The men and women were also split into sections. As you can see here, men, women, and then the boys here. Not much room for anybody. And then this really, what I took the most away from this is that no matter how much you might complain about getting all your stuff from Wake and, moving it back from here, you can't put into perspective spending months at a time in a position like this where you can't do anything, and it's just awful. But yeah, that's about it.
Great. Thank you, Jack. It's a very difficult images, but as you pointed to, they were incredibly important in the history of the abolition movement. Rings were made that had the imprint of the Brooks in just tiny scale, and people. This is a question of visibility, one that we are right up against right now. If we put that image side by side with the visceral and horrific images of George Floyd's death, it's that same ability to see what's happening that was created by the Brooks, a way of giving people an eye into what happens all the time that they couldn't see otherwise, by just making those images, those brutal, horrible images, visible. Good. Questions, comments on this? We'll get into it in a little bit more detail in a minute. Great. So first, a comment on your exam. If you didn't see my messages yesterday, I totally messed up the way that the essay was scored, and so it counted as 1 point instead of counting as 10. And I will go through and hand grade everything and then re-enter your scores to make sure that your essays count as they should. For some of you, this will increase your grade because you are stronger on the essays, say, than on the multiple choice. For some, it might lower it a bit, and for some, it should keep it relatively similar. But I will work on that over the week, and it should be finished by next weekend. If you have any questions in particular, feel free to email me about it. Okay. All right. Here we are again with an image of the Brooks. Before we get into this further, and I guess you're going to see subtitles today. Sometimes they're on, sometimes they're not. I want to ask you a little bit about your reading and the video that you watched. What were some of your comments and thoughts on that? Yeah, Ellen.
I thought it was really interesting, the perspective that it took, that architecture was responsible for like these horrific conditions and slavery, because like that's not something I've ever thought about. Like I thought it was more like a problem of people being terrible, but if you think about it, like architecture was an issue as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's super well said. The two go hand in hand together, right? There wouldn't have been the architecture without the people, and without the people, we couldn't have developed the architecture. Yeah, of these spaces that we see again and again throughout history. Good. Sophie, you were nodding too. Did you have thoughts on that point?
Yeah, I thought it was just really interesting how they talked about over time they developed adding the nets and how they had like curved sails to try and create ventilation for the lower decks, even though that didn't really work. They like were trying to make adaptations and have how they could barricade the crew so if there were any type of revolts. So I think that's just really interesting how all the thought that they went into to make these slave ships like dehumanize these people as much as possible.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about a group of, engineers, architects, ship designers, ship builders sitting in a room and thinking this through. How can we put more people in there? How can we reduce the risk of revolt, as you said? All these different things that they had to take time calculating out and thinking about specifically, and then let alone actually doing the building and still feeling like, okay, this is an idea we should follow through on. Good. Any other thoughts about that? Yeah, Matthew.
Yeah, I thought it was like honestly one of the most like troubling and atrocious things I've ever read. Like I follow history. I've read a lot of history, and that was something that like I almost got unfathomable. I was like grossed out of my own skin while reading it, just like kind of how atrocious it was. I definitely kind of moving on what Ellen and Sophie said, like it was truly fascinating, and Jack touched on it too, just like the limited space they gave these people. Like when I read it, I imagined myself like how I like get uncomfortable after lying in a bed of a night's sleep, right? And these people are in the same position for months. It was just astounding. I also liked the TED Talk was really good, kind of talking, shifting more to like modern day, like urban planning, and how architecture today still kind of perpetuates these same issues in a different form.
Yep, absolutely. Well put. Yeah, Christina.
Just the idea that you were touching on also earlier about the importance of photos and also like verbal accounts from survivors of what was going on in all these different situations, and how written form of history is not always everyone's perspective, doesn't cover all the points of view that need to be covered. So
Yep, absolutely true. Absolutely. What about just the theme of architecture and violence? If we take it outside, the specificity of the slaver ships and the history of human enslavement. What are some places where you can see that architectural violence? Subtle, dramatic. Let me start with something easy. So I heard the author of that article give a talk once, and it centered on the way that people's bodies are moved onto platforms for the subway. He took a series of images. Some of them were in Japan, where you had, walls that kept X amount of people in one space so that when the subway door opened, only the people between those short walls could go in. It's not something we think about as violent. In some way, we think about it as organized. It helps get everybody onto the subway or onto the train in a manageable way. But if you start to think further, it's a way that architects use materiality, they use design to orient bodies in space. And this can be for positive outcomes, and it can be for dramatically racist outcomes. It can be for just mundane, getting people through a grocery store outcome, So if you think about it in that lens, what are some other kind of daily forms of architectural, if not violence, but architectural maneuvering? Yeah, Lucas.
I mean, going with what you said, I know there was an example given in one of my math classes. I'm studying fluid flow, and it was how to stop people from clogging exits, like emergency exits in like shot fire and a theater or something.
Yeah,
they almost always have columns on either side because the people are trying to get in right next to them, like versus going straight through it and coming in at a strange angle. It crowds the exits. So they place columns next to exits to force people to kind of go through them straight.
Fascinating. Great example. What else? Yeah, Christina.
this isn't necessarily towards the violent side, but right now, everything going on with the quarantining and the organization of people in supermarkets, even just the like tape on the ground with the arrows and stuff causing you to go one way or another, despite which way you'd prefer to go.
Yeah.
It's kind of an example of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example, a very timely example. Good. What else? I think all of you have had to live in the dorms at Wake, is that correct? How are those structured to guide your body in space, for example? Faithon or Rosie, any comments on that?
Wait, can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So I guess in my dorm, like when I was in Luder, my roommate's bed and my bed, they touched, so it was in like an L shape. So I guess it kind of, obviously it's nowhere near like the slave ships or anything like that, but nowhere at all. But it was just very tight, and I felt like I almost couldn't turn over to her side because her feet were where my head was. So it was just like very tight and almost felt like uncomfortable every night sleeping in that position. Yeah, so that's pretty much.
That's a great way that design orders bodies, right? And certainly here we're talking about very mundane things, just to get in the mindset of the way that design orders bodies. Great. Faithon, did you have a?
Oh, yes. So I'm currently in Polo, so I'm currently in a really like comfortable environment. But last semester, when I was a freshman, I was in the Babcock, and I would say the room is comparably small compared to like Polo. So I can feel like kind of like when I live with my roommate, it's kind of like a little bit crowded when she brought some of her friends to the room. So it was like kind of difficult condition.
Sure. It restricts how many people you can have in the room. It restricts your comfort, your privacy, your exposure, all of those things. Even just on a, sometimes you don't even realize them, right? So that's the base level of just like, my room is X feet by X feet, and I can't run across it, for example. Totally not a harm, but a way that your body is shaped by the world around you, the architecture around you. Let's take it to another level. Thinking about, let's think about park benches for a minute, or benches at the airport. The last time you went to an airport gate, anything you noticed about how those are structured, what they're doing? Yeah, Matthew.
I know a lot of park benches are intentionally designed to have like a pole in the middle, so it prevents anyone from sleeping on them. And it's similar to the airport as well. You have like, they're all just like single seats compared to like more spread out benches.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a terrific, I will try to post this podcast episode. It's on, I think it's called Aggressive Design, where they're designing park benches, they're designing subway stops, things that prevent people from being comfortable there. It's intentional, non-loitering activity, but it does also, they are public spaces. Why couldn't someone sleep there if they would like? What about public space allows that to be managed by design in that way? And did we give those designers permission or not? Where does that come from? It's a behavioral adjustment brought on by the designer. Good. Any other examples on that scale? Yeah, Gabby.
I was gonna say, I feel like a lot of the airport benches are always facing one another, so I don't know if that's because they want people to more like interact with each other. I know like I always see people in front of me, I'm like, oh, can you watch my suitcase while I go to the bathroom?
Yeah,
like,
interesting.
It creates almost like a social environment in airports, at least.
Yeah, it's a great point because there are other options. They could be all in rows like a theater. They could be in many different ways. Yeah, good. Anything else along those lines? Okay. All right, we'll move forward. I have to tell you that
one quick last thing.
Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Aren't casinos purposely made to try to funnel you to the back of a casino and not keep you near light? And it's almost like a labyrinth.
Yeah, excellent.
That'd be an architectural choice to keep you trapped.
Yep, excellent work. Right, a funneling of people to make sure you're further and further in. You're less likely to be like, yeah, let's turn around and leave. Yeah, great point. And also there are many, this has to do more with product placement, but a lot of grocery stores put the essentials at the very back of the grocery store so that you have to navigate through more aisles than you otherwise would if you were just coming in and out to get milk. Now for people for whom navigation isn't a problem, it's all right, you walk a little further to get the milk. For people where that kind of motion is taxing, we're putting a toll on their bodies that they're required to move further. People with disabilities, people with injuries, for example, it makes it more complicated. Okay, great.
The eye level on in aisles of grocery stores as well. Certain companies pay for their products to be at eye level as well, which is interesting.
Yep, absolutely. And when you start to think about this further, you'll begin to see it in many places. It's difficult now because we aren't out in public space the way we will be hopefully a year from now. But the way that you look at parks, thinking about sidewalks, thinking about all of the different ways that human bodies are directed in space. And then once you change your lens, moving into neighborhoods where the public services are not as active, where people are left to their own care, where taxes aren't used and they don't spread as far, then we start to see this even further, the more and more detrimental ways that architecture could intervene in a positive manner, and that's all dependent on the architects, but often intervenes in a harmful way. All right. So let me back this up. So the lens that I want to move us through is in thinking about architecture and the construction of race is the development of the sugar industry, particularly in the Caribbean. We'll look at that example. We'll look at an example in North America as well. But to start, one of the ways that we can frame the production of sugar, let's say through a scientific lens, comes through this prologue, which just simply states that sugarcane is one of the most efficient photosynthesizers in the plant kingdom, and converting up to 1% of incident solar energy into sugar. It provides nearly 70% of the world's sugar. It's the highest yielding calorie producer per unit area of any living species. It generates up to 15 kilograms of cane sugar per meter of sunshine, in ideal conditions. And it continues to be the world's largest crop by production quantity. So if you were sitting on the side of the table and you're trying to think, oh, we're farmers, we're agriculturalists, what should we go into? Sugarcane looks pretty great. High energy food, it's something people love, so that seems like a really good start. What are we looking at here? Are you seeing my screen? Did I set that up? Okay, good. What are we looking at here?
The right-hand picture looks like a home from the early 20th century.
Great, yeah, it's a Victorian era home. And specifically, it's a parlor. The idea of the parlor came about as a space for serving sugar, tea, and coffee. Before the rise and the democratization isn't the right word, but ability for more people to purchase coffee, tea, and sugar, people didn't have parlors. But once there was this thing that needed to be served, a whole new room was constructed in homes that had the means to invite people in to be served coffee, tea, and sugar. It's mind-blowing. It would be like suddenly if you brought something new home from the grocery store and you were like, I need a whole new room for this. It was that special. It was that, it was such a status symbol at the time, each of those three commodities, that a whole new room, it deserved a whole new room. Okay, what else are we looking at?
There's like the classic diner with the like bar stool seating, the countertop, the like tiles and all of that.
Yeah, so does anyone know specifically, it is a diner form. Do you know specifically what this is showing?
Assuming it's an ice cream parlor.
Yeah, it's either an ice cream parlor or a soda fountain. Again, for the consumption of sugar, either in ice cream form or in soda form. And then what have you got in the bottom?
Is that an ice cream truck?
Yeah, it's a little ice cream truck for the distribution of sugar on the city streets. So all these different architectural forms emerge, from elaborate, elite, and stationary to mobile and more accessible. So those are sort of the fun architectural forms of sugar, and now we're going to look at the more complex and difficult ones. As was mentioned in our earlier discussion about the brooks, what is known as the triangle trade is essential to the distribution of sugar from the Caribbean and the southern part of the United States, as well as Brazil, where it was grown, to Europe and to the rest of the so-called Western world at the time. So beginning in Europe, slaver ships like the Brooks that we examined were loaded up generally with guns and gunpowder, which were taken to the western coast of Africa. From there, those guns and gunpowder were traded for enslaved humans who were being held there, awaiting those ships. Those people, families, were packed into those horrific conditions. And the trip across that Atlantic Ocean took on average about 3 months. Once they arrived, I'm showing you specifically once they arrived in the Caribbean, but you can see the arrows to where the rest of those ships were directed to South America, Central, and North America. And as we saw from an earlier image, some of them also went around the southern tip of Africa over into the Indian subcontinent. There, the people who had been forced onto the ships were unloaded and sold at an auction, and then the same space that they were forced into was filled up with rum, sugar, and other sugar products to be sold back to the continent of Europe and to England at the time. And then this whole process would start all over again. That's just the technical components of how that thing worked. Of course, as was pointed out, the brutality, the difficulty, the risk to life, the dehumanizing circumstances under which these people were forced to leave, to travel, and then to work, it's beyond what we can think of sometimes. And we've already heard a great thorough description of what was going on with this image of the Brooks. I want to point out that the Brooks is a graphic showing the most ideal conditions. These are the most optimal conditions that could be found, and they are far from optimal. So just keeping that in mind, that this isn't even a graphic showing the worst possible conditions, it's showing the best, where people are not on top of one another. Beyond the architecture of the ships, there is the architecture of the sugar processing. And for most Europeans, North Americans, Central and Southern Americans who weren't directly involved in sugar plantations, didn't know someone who had a sugar plantation, had never visited one, which wasn't a huge amount of people, but it was a good percentage. What they were seeing about the development of the sugar industry really revolved around this machinery. This sugar processing machinery held a fascination, just like, I don't know, whatever the latest tech, where people are just mesmerized by what this machinery can do. It's just gonna change the world. It makes everything more efficient, more productive. It was overwhelming for many humans, to the point where they often could leave behind the fact that there were human beings powering the machines. The machines themselves were so marvelous that they forgot who was in them and working them. And we can see this in the visualizations in these lithographs from the time. So just take a minute with either of the two images, look carefully and take a note or two, and then we'll come back to discuss what you see. Okay, great. So what stands out first in either of the images you chose to analyze or look carefully at? Yes, Lucas.
For me, I noticed like a mushroom top of the machine. I don't know exactly what it's for. It looks like it might be some sort of screw machine.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so that cap at the top really stands out on the mill itself. Good, and yes, it has a kind of mushroom shape, and its shape is largely to balance those two long side arms that are coming out. Good. What else?
like distinction between the different steps from what they're doing. Like it goes from like the machine in the center, and then it looks like there's almost a pipe like open that goes under like boards on the right picture, and then into like a tub where a man is stirring, I guess.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So that is the sluice. Sometimes it could be a tube, some kind of pipe. Sometimes it was just a trench cut out of the ground and then usually lined with stone. For the processed sugar, which would become kind of liquefied, to run down the hill into those processing spaces. Good. Okay, Rosie?
And then also going off about like the mushroom shape, it almost kind of reminds me of like how similar to how mushrooms are part of nature, like these machines are part of like human nature. Like humans are putting their effort and work into this. It's not simply a machine, as you were saying.
Yeah.
Like humans are them, powering them. So it's kind of connecting it back to the like earth and the natural environment, both from the mushroom shape and human beings themselves.
Nice.
And then also you can see how it looks like very hot and dry, not many trees, and the conditions probably were terrible outside, adding on to everything else.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Let's talk about the human bodies that are depicted here. They're not the first thing that stands out. As we've noticed, you pointed out many different things that were designed to stand out in the images first. Sophie?
Yeah, the first thing that I noticed about the humans themselves is most of them are wearing pretty minimal clothing, except for the one man in the front who seems to be like interesting, because obviously I'm sure it's really hot and these people are doing a lot of labor, but also you kind of want to protect yourself from the sun, and there's not really that sort of aspect, other than what I'm assuming is the white man in this picture is the only one kind of like protecting themselves from the sun, and the other people are just working really hard and don't have that same amount of clothing.
Yeah, right. And the one in the front, and I'm imagining you're meaning in this kind of sepia toned graphic over here to the right. There's a way.
The one on the left, actually.
Oh, on the left. Okay, this one who is clothed. Yeah. Good. Any other observations on the bodies?
I also feel like the drawing as a whole, both of them kind of look like these engineering, like mathematical pictures. And then the fact that people are even included in them like seems kind of weird. And in the sepia kind of color one, you can see like the individual steps are like lettered in a way that would denote like this comes first, this is the next step, but then it's like the people doing the jobs, which is like off.
Yeah, absolutely. So these sorts of images would have been in the equivalent of like the Scientific American today. They were illustrative, as you're saying. This is how this machinery works. And in that process of showing how this machinery works, especially the image on the left, but throughout there's just a body of this type of graphic, this type of lithograph, this kind of print. The over here on the left in particular, you know that they're bodies, but they don't have any specificity. They are drawn in such a way that they become more a part of the machinery than they do as standout humans themselves. And that was done on purpose as a way of de-emphasizing the enslavement that was required for the sugar industry to work. Let's just see this over and over again. So let's look at that machinery a little bit. I realize I need to move through this a little more quickly, but we're looking at a series of ingenios, and this would be the word in Spanish, which just means sugar mill. And they would come in several different forms. On the left, you'll see the wind-powered form. This would have been more common in the Dutch colonies. These centralized ingenios were more common where you had people and donkeys and bodies involved, were more common in the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. And I want to show you just a little bit in detail how they worked. It's a brutal story. It's brutal on several different fronts. First, the sugar the sugar that was processed, sugar cane, once it's reached a point of ripeness, that's not the right term, but once it's ready to be harvested, the landowner knew that they had 72 hours to get it processed. After that, it would spoil. So everything on the plantation stopped. Every person working on the plantation, whether they were mothers, children, or otherwise, everyone would be brought into the service of processing the sugar. It had to happen quickly and it had to happen efficiently. And generally, that meant when it came to, these are what we're looking at here are basically the gears, the actual grinding mill part of those ingenios themselves. So in order to get sugarcane through those tight spaces, often women were asked to do the work because on average they had smaller hands. So they would be there feeding the sugarcane into those mills, into those grinding spaces. Sometimes, and this is brutal, I apologize for it happening, but I didn't cause it, but I hate to, it's terrible to even talk about and difficult. But as the women were feeding these in, you know, often their arms would get caught. And because of the requirements of that sugar processing, the landowners or the overseers driving the action often wouldn't stop when the arms were torn off and ripped in because they couldn't stop the works, they couldn't back up the process. It's just beyond brutal what it took to process something that we would have in ice cream. You know, just that disparity is so huge. From there, once it has been processed in those mill spaces, in those grinding spaces, then there's a series of sloughs, which take it from, let's see, on the left, this would have been the mill space, and humans and or pack animals would be used to grind those gears or circulate and pull those gears around within that space. And then sloughs would be cut in the floor that would take it into a room that looks like the image on the right. And there it would go, that sugar, that sweet liquidy substance at that point, is not quite sugar yet, would be moved through a series of cauldrons that are at different temperatures, cooling over time as it moved from the front of the room to the back. So it would become more and more crystallized. Once the early 20th century moved into the mid-century, into the 1960s, 1950s and 60s, the architecture of sugar changed. It modernized in a way that it became more factory-like. This didn't change the risk for the people involved, but it did change the hierarchy and the structures, moving it from this kind of classical plantation model into a capitalist model. Still again, where that highly efficient, highly desirable commodity took first place over the workers involved. I don't have time to go into that to detail, but I do want to highlight the people who were involved because so many of those images are generally just of the machinery, but the work itself took place in these very hot fields. Sugarcane thrives in tropical conditions. You can see that people are clothed, as was mentioned, so that they are covering their skin from the sun. It's hot, brutal work most of the time. The enslaved people working these fields had little more than just the sugarcane to suck on to keep them fed and going while they were doing the work. All right, then let's take the last remainder of the class probably to look at this. Around the same period that the economies of sugar hit their height, where the economies of enslavement hit their peak, a movement, the Romantic movement, which you may have studied in literature or other spheres, sort of overcame or took over as the European sensibility for writing about nature. This is the first time that nature kind of came to the fore as a thing, that anyone thought about nature at all, rather than just thinking about their fields or the pear tree in their front yard. But nature as a concept started to take hold. And with that, the idea of the picturesque, a way of painting nature in its most ideal form, or of photographing, sketching, or drawing nature in its most ideal form. So take a minute to look at this image, look carefully, and then think about all the things that it evokes for you. Okay, what are we looking at? What comes up? Babe.
So I was looking at the picture and I see that there is some juxtaposition. Like the picture is basically like cut in half. The lower part sends kind of a sense of stillness from like the water and the birds just, you know, flying just right above the water. Whereas the higher part of the picture has this really big and heavy looking mountain with the clouds kind of covering the peak, and it just brings like the sense of kind of like contrary to stillness, something bigger, more powerful in a sense.
Nice, well done. What else do you see? Yeah, Lucas.
I immediately kind of gravitated to the single stalk of sugarcane right in the front, and the birds are using that as almost like a food, so that might be their sustenance. Because as I look out at the island, it looks like rock. I
Yeah,
don't see trees or grass or any sort of nourishment. So
right.
that's kind of the only living thing in the photo, aside from obviously somebody's on the ships, but
Yeah,
you can't see them.
yeah, excellent. What else? What about that ship? See Brad or Gabby? Safe on. Yeah, Brad.
It kind of looks like that ship is just like kind of passing by, the one in the front, and then there's one that's like in the cove back there.
Yeah.
Usually I know boats will do that when they're like spending the night or something because the waves aren't bad in the cove. So
Nice.
I don't know what they'd be doing over there. Honestly, it doesn't seem like there's much on that island.
No, it doesn't, does there? It doesn't. But that's a great insight into the two ships and the cove. Good. Anything else? Yeah, Caitlin.
And there's a clear contrast between like the boat and the mountain behind it, like to emphasize the massive, how massive the mountain is.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We get this terrifically dramatically different sense of scale from the two by seeing them together. If we didn't have the boat, we wouldn't understand the monumentality of the mountain. Good. Great work. What about the viewer? Where is the viewer in this painting? Where are we looking from if we're an imagined figure in there? Yeah, yeah.
I think it's somewhere near shore, like maybe on another island or a piece of land, because you can kind of see how the water's shallow and then you see less into the water.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. So we're standing on a shore. The lone piece of visible life is held between that piece of sugarcane floating out there, right, and the birds that are landing on it. So great reading of this. This particular piece was commissioned by one of the largest plantation owners who owned this side of the land behind us. He asked the artist Van Best to come and do engravings of his property. And in order to get around the difficulty of what Van Best saw when he got there, which is of course hundreds of enslaved people working the fields, Van Best instead decided to look out at nature. How can I make this beautiful for this plantation owner? So we have the hint We have the hint that he owned this, that this was a sugar plantation, just in that lone, desolate, floating bit of sugarcane. We have two ships in the background that were designed by Van Best to look and mimic the ships of the enslavers. And then we have the monumentality of this thing that he's trying to address echoing in that mountain. It's all done in this way that we don't actually see the people involved. We don't actually see what's happening. And that's really what characterizes the picturesque, a way of idealizing out the reality of a situation. And this comes up again and again and again in the paintings, in the work of this time period. And the juxtaposition couldn't be crazier between the brutality of the work that's happening in these places and the calm, tranquil beauty that you get in these images. Sometimes have people, you can see the upper part of this diptych. There are people in that boat. And there's somebody here, but most of all, you get the machinery, right? Most of all, you get the island life. Don't get what's really happening there. And I'm bringing this to the fore because it comes up not right now, thankfully not right now. We're seeing everything front and center. We're not seeing everything, but we're seeing a lot more front and center. But the human mind has this fallback, or it has this safety net where it can sort of just fade out the things that are difficult. And we see that really coming to the fore in this way of painting. Now, I realize we are an architecture class, not a painting class, but all of these things weigh into the way the architecture, the visuality, the way that people saw or chose to see at this time was constructed. Okay, we are past time. I have another section left, so I'm going to post that. I'll record it and post it on the site or on Canvas. Do you guys have any other questions on this? Comments? Okay, thanks for your great discussion today. Now on Wednesday, you have a field trip where you will be doing a brick field trip of your own, and I don't think I see you again on Friday even because you're doing group work. I'll send out more details on how those should roll out. Be sure to read the instructions and get back to me with questions if you have them. And I'm available anytime for office hours if you just want to talk things through. So, okay, thanks y'all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.